So here we are at what appears to be the walls of old Shushan the palace, and we want to look at chapter 8 of Daniel, and that chapter takes us into college level study. We've had primary school where we learned three basic principles. We learned that the Bible and the Bible only must be our interpreter, that the book of Daniel is going to deal with four prophetic outlines and four stories. The first one with God's kingdom and its restoration. The second one with God's king and his restoration. The third one with God's sanctuary and its restoration. And the fourth one with God's people and their restoration. So those are two of the principles we learned. And we also learned that God deals with humanity, giving them time, test, which is a crisis, and the results. So we've seen in the prophecy of chapter 2 the principle of 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, bang. That's the way that the grade school taught us how to understand these prophecies. When we got to secondary school in chapter 7, it went 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, little horn, bang. So those principles we must keep in mind as we enter college, because in college they're not going to teach us over again everything that we should have already learned. And in college, we're going to come with the question, where is Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, that Greek leader from the Seleucid dynasty, where does he appear in Daniel 8? So as we open the chapter, we see that Daniel has a vision and that he's at Shushan by the Ulai River. That's the palace of Queen Esther. That's the winter palace of the kings of Medo-Persia. So we already know that we're going to start with Medo-Persia. This is in the third year of Belshazzar. That means he's about ready to be killed at the takeover of the Medo-Persians. So we're going to start with Medo-Persia, and Medo-Persia is represented by a ram with two horns, one bigger than the other, the Medes being lesser than the Persians, who became great and conquered the world and dominated it until along came a he-goat. And that he-goat had a notable horn in the middle of its head, and that he-goat, we're told in chapter 8, represents Grecia. And if we're going to take the principle of the Bible and the Bible only, that's the only place in the Bible where you can show that the third empire of Nebuchadnezzar's image, or the third beast, the leopard with wings, in Daniel's night vision, is Greece. Nowhere else in the Bible can you prove that. So we must see that from the Bible and the Bible only, we're following the same pattern that we had in chapter 2 and in chapter 7. And we know that chapter 7 should deal with the restoration of God's sanctuary. And sure enough, it starts out talking about sanctuary animals, a ram and a he-goat, especially animals for the Day of Atonement. And it talks about, in verse 14, the restoration, the cleansing of God's sanctuary. So we see that we are dealing with the restoration of the sanctuary, the same prophetic outline that we've had in other chapters. So in this chapter, we skip over the Roman Empire, because it says at the end of the reign of the four Grecian generals that took over from Alexander the Great, that at the end of their reign, then they came from the four winds. That was the 4 points of the compass, the king of the north and the king of the south, we'll learn about in chapter 11. And from those four winds, it says there came up a little horn. Now, if you are a consistent Bible student, you know that we are following the principles we learned in grade school and in secondary school. And this little horn is exactly the same as the little horn of Daniel 7. What he does is the same. He attacks God's people. He's a very intelligent entity, and he tries to change God's times and God's laws. And so in this chapter, it says he tries to bring the ministry of Christ in heaven. That's the daily sacrifice, the daily, which is talked about in in Numbers and other places in the Pentateuch, is the continual daily service in God's sanctuary. And it says that he attacks that, he brings it, and he puts it on earth, and he gives it to a host of his own representatives. And what did we learn that Daniel's praying about? He's praying for the forgiveness of sins. And so here, the forgiveness of sins has been taken out of heaven and put down on earth in a priesthood that tries to deal with forgiving of sins in a confessional. That's the abomination of desolation, and that's what the little horn brings in, and that's what we will find when we come to chapter 11 also is talked about, and clearly in chapter 11 it comes after the cross of Christ. So where is Antiochus Epiphanes in chapter 8? He's not there. Almost all the scholars of the evangelical world point to this little horn in chapter 8 as being something different than the little horn that comes after Rome and after the 10 horns. And they say, oh, this must be Antiochus Epiphanes because he offered a pig on the altar, and the Maccabeans revolted, and after a few years they got the sanctuary back in somewhat of order for their people. No, Antiochus Epiphanes is nowhere in Daniel 8. If we stay with what we've learned in kindergarten, in primary school, and in secondary school, this prophecy follows the other prophecies, and it has a big bang just like the others do. And that big bang says, and unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So the big bang in chapter 1 was the rock that struck the image in its feet, in the 10 toes. And the big bang in chapter 7 was the Christ, the king that comes before the Father and receives the kingdom. He's inaugurated as king in chapter 7. And here in chapter 8, the sanctuary is cleansed at the end of a period of 2,300 days, or prophetically, years. So that being the case, Daniel is trying to understand how is it that his people who were supposed to return from captivity should have to wait such a long period of time until the sanctuary is cleansed. And he falls sick at the end of this vision. But we are given chapter 9, and so was Daniel. And when we come to chapter 9, Gabriel will come back and explain the vision more perfectly. But we need to see that the Big Bang is the same Big Bang of chapter 7 as the same Big Bang of chapter 2, and will be the same Big Bang in chapter 11, where it says, and at that time shall Michael stand up for the deliverance of thy people. So we have in chapter 8 the restoration of God's sanctuary as the Big Bang, corresponding with the judgment in chapter 7, with the stone that strikes the image in chapter 2, and with Michael standing up for the deliverance of his people in chapter 11. So this prophecy jumps over Rome and the 10 kings and goes straight to telling us much more detail about the little horn, and that his work is especially to substitute Christ's work. He changes times and laws, and all those scholars that would like to point to Antiochus Epiphanes are joining that little horn in trying to change the clear context of the book of Daniel with its 4 parallel prophecies, and trying to move and to look back to some event in Israel's history as the fulfillment of the cleansing of God's sanctuary. We'll learn more about that in chapter 9, but we can be sure that the Big Bang follows the same in each prophetic outline, and it will bring the cleansing of God's sanctuary. That's the sanctuary in heaven, because that's the sanctuary that exists at the end of the 2,300 days. That's the sanctuary that Christ ministers in, and that's the sanctuary that needs to have the sins that have been of God's people that have been confessed and recorded there. Christ bears those sins as the high priest, and the sanctuary bears those sins. All those need to be taken out, all those confessed sins, and removed from the sanctuary. That will cleanse the sanctuary so that God can then deliver his people, and we will go home to heaven.